Our speaker, John Carmody, dedicated member of the Oneida Carry Research Group. This group has been doing great work digging deep into the records and keep the story of the Carry alive. This afternoon, John will guide us along the historic waterway, specifically focusing on the history and significance of Fort Rickey, a name that most of us associate with the zoo, Discovery Zoo. It's also going to hear about Wood Creek, Canada Creek, to understand the logistics, conflicts, and commerce that define these vital 18th century waterways. So please join me in giving him a welcome to our friend, Mr. John Carmody.
Well, thank you. I am John Carmody. I am the president of the Oneida Carry Research Group. That's our mission statement from the Oneida Carry Research Group. Endeavors to research and share the historical details and impact of the Oneida Carry on our city, Rome, New York, state and nation. We encourage experiences that educate and enlighten the public and establish meaningful connections to our community's history. And to learn more, there's information for contact. Today we're talking about the Fort Rickey and the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek. That's a long title. I wanted to just say Fort Rickey and the lower landing of Wood Creek, but a lot of people probably wouldn't know what the lower landing means. So it's all about how we got that sign and about the confluence of Canada Creek and Wood Creek. That's called the lower landing on Wood Creek. And you can see there are two creeks involved here, Canada Creek from the north and Wood Creek coming from east to west. So this is the Great Oneida Carrying Place. Sometimes it's called the Dio-Wainsta, which is Iroquois for, in short, where one carries a canoe from one stream to another. Now, let me describe what you see here at the carry. Where this green arrow is, that's the carry. That's pretty much today's Dominic Street in Rome, New York. The Mohawk River and Wood Creek are two streams that come from the north, and when they get to present-day Rome, New York, they part ways. Mohawk River comes from the north, and it turns to the east, where it will connect with the Hudson River and then the Atlantic Ocean. Wood Creek, on the other hand, when it gets to Rome, it turns to the west, and it will go to Oneida Lake, and then the Oneida River, Oswego River, and Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River, and then that will go to the Atlantic Ocean. But along both streams, there are places called landings. On the Mohawk River, there is the lower landing and the upper landing. On Wood Creek, there is the upper landing of Wood Creek, what I call the mid landing, and the lower, sometimes I call it the lowest landing. How this operates is, in the 18th century, there are no good roads out here on the frontier. Travel is reliant upon streams like the Mohawk River and Wood Creek and Oneida Lake, which is fine until you get here. Now you have to take your boats and anything you're carrying across and refloat it on the next stream. That's why it's called the carry. Sometimes we call it a portage. During times of high water levels, like this springtime, a bateau, which is a flat-bottomed boat built for navigating shallow streams, a bateau could get as far as the upper landing on the Mohawk River. This is approximately where Whitesboro Street in Rome is, across from the former, let's see, what was that restaurant there? Coalyard Charlie's, okay? And then they could go across maybe just about a mile and get to the upper landing of Wood Creek, but often they got down to the mid landing before it was deep enough, because now you have added water from Mud Creek, and then refloat their bateau and head west. But during low water, which was very often, those bateaux could only get as far as the lower landing on the Mohawk River. This is where Martin Street is, just east of the train station in Rome. And so they would have to get out, take their bateau and their materials, and cross all the way over to the lowest landing. Now you have the added water of Canada Creek to Wood Creek. And now you could probably refloat your bateau and head westward. But now we're talking about 7 miles of overland carrying. Let's see. This map shows the British supply route from the Oneida Carry to their forts at Oswego on Lake Ontario early in 1756 during the French and Indian War. And here is Oswego. Those little dots you see up here, those are 3 British forts on Lake Ontario. They were first built to support the Indian fur trade, but they're also built to threaten and attack the French up in Canada. Canada would be up in this area, okay, New France. But there was nothing all the way back to little, German Flats as the nearest English settlement. Supplies had to come up from as far away as Schenectady, halfway down the Mohawk Valley, to keep these forts supplied and reinforced. And all along this way, there was nothing there. No forts, no settlements, no support. This is Indian land, Oneidas and Onondaga. Eventually, the British decide to build some forts here. This is the Oneida Carry. So this is the Mohawk River, and this is Wood Creek here. So there's the portage that they're going to need to reinforce. These are the 3 forts at Oswego on Lake Ontario in 1756. Fort Ontario, Fort Oswego, and Fort George. There's Oswego. Here's the larger Fort Ontario. I need a volunteer from the audience. Who wants to be a volunteer? This is not hard. Okay. You, young lady. Your name is Mary?
Not your cousin.
Would you agree with me that the shape of this fort is a rectangle with 4 pointy things called bastions? Yes, so you need to remember that, Mary. Okay. It's a rectangle with 4 bastions. So what shape is it? A rectangle. Okay, thank you. To get the marker that you saw earlier, we did a lot of research, and we had to find primary sources to do the research in order to get the sign. So one of the things we looked at was the journal of William Hervey. He was a medical officer with the British Army, and he's traveling through the Oneida Carry in 1755. And that's Bill right there. He writes on July 28, 1755, as he's on his way to Fort Oswego, he writes, "The Grenadiers and Colonel's company were detached forward to Canada Creek, 8 miles, with their baggage on sleighs to guard the remainder of the baggage when sent up by the other companies behind." And he goes on, "Wood Creek was about 2 yards broad and very shallow, which is the reason the baggage is sent on forwarder." And he goes on about Canada Creek. "This is a little creek which runs from the northeast into Wood Creek." And he says, "Sleighs came up with the baggage." So he's at the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek, the lower landing on Wood Creek. And he's saying sleds or sleighs are coming with baggage across the Oneida Carry. So here's how it worked. Often supplies had to be hauled over the Oneida Carry Road. When transported to the lower landing of Wood Creek, this trip was 7 miles over a rugged and crude roadway. Sleds were used instead of wheeled vehicles because wheels were more likely to break down on the rough road. The sleds were pulled by oxen. So the Carry had very rough roads. You know, some things don't change in Rome. Bateaux were hauled across the Oneida Carry on wheeled carriages to the mid-landing or lower landing of Wood Creek and reloaded there to continue their voyage to Oneida Lake. So there you can see a bateau being taken out of the Mohawk River, put on a wheeled carriage, and transported. This is the Carry Road here. There's the Carry again, and landing places could be very perilous, very dangerous places in those days. You never knew when you were going to be attacked by a roaming party of French and Indians. So Hervey continues to describe an incident that happened while he was at the lower landing of where Wood Creek joins Canada Creek. He says, at 10 at night, we were alarmed by our out sentries in the woods reporting to the relieving corporal that they heard the footsteps of several people nigh them, but could not see them being extremely dark, on which the picket was turned out, and a corporal and 4 detached to search into it, with orders to fire on anybody that did not answer after the 3rd time challenging. And a little time after, they fired and returned crying, "Turn out!" on which we immediately were under arms and sent small parties to scour round the out sentries, who soon returned but did not see anything. We stood to our arms till 1, that's in the morning, and then dismissed the half of our men to relieve the other half in 2 hours. We had not above 80 effective, several of our men being employed in the bateaux. About half after 2 in the morning, we were alarmed again by one of the out sentries firing, upon which we all turned out and remained under arms until 5. He said that he saw 3 or 4 Indians advancing towards him. When he challenged 3 times, and upon their not answering, he fired, and they ran away. In the morning, several of our soldiers went into the woods and saw the footsteps of several people, it being a rainy night, and on the other side of the creek, some Indian huts. Whether friends or enemies, we could not find out. But it was on the side next to the enemy's country, and we had great reason to imagine they would molest us in this place, as it was the repository of our provisions and baggage, which, if lost, would entirely stop our march. So, a portage or carrying site was considered a weak point because this is where travelers were most vulnerable to ambush, thus the need to fortify the landing sites at carrying places. He goes on, we struck our tents at 5 in the morning and crossed over Canada Creek, just where we encamped to the point of land formed by its running into Wood Creek. Our bateaux with baggage went down Wood Creek at the same time, and we marched on the north side of it for Oneida Lake, to which they call it 14 miles, but are very long. So the baggage and the bateau were navigating Wood Creek to Oneida Lake, but the men marched along the roadway on the north side of Wood Creek. In late 1755 and 1756, the British built 5 forts to guard the landing places on the Oneida Carry. One of them, Fort Bull, was destroyed in a French raid. During the French and Indian War, in August of 1756, the French captured and destroyed those 3 British forts at Oswego on Lake Ontario. The British then destroyed their 4 forts on the Oneida Carry and retreated to German Flats. Their position on the Oneida Carry was abandoned. Their retreat also left the Mohawk Valley open for French and Indian raids. 2 years later, in 1758, the British wanted to reestablish their post at Oswego. To do this, first, they needed to secure the Oneida Carry again. This time, they decided to build a major fort on the Carry. So in the summer of 1758, they began construction of Fort Stanwix. And there you see the diagram of 1758 Fort Stanwix and the configuration of buildings within the fort as they appeared during the French and Indian War. This is different than what you would see at the reconstructed Fort Stanwix National Monument that portrayed the time of the Revolution. This drawing, described by Oneida Carry Research Group member Alan Sterling and drawn by artist Gary Zaboli, shows Fort Stanwix being built in the distance. So you see that flag up here, that's Fort Stanwix. The walls of Fort Williams and Craven were rebuilt to protect those troops while Fort Stanwix was being built. The scene depicts some of the activity that would have taken place on the upper landing place of the Mohawk River, near where Whitesboro Street in Rome is today. Now, this is the picture I took of the lower landing. This is the focus of this presentation. I'm standing on what was an island back in the 18th century, and I'm looking north. So in front of me is Wood Creek, and it's flowing from right to left westward. What I'm looking at to the north here, this stream here is Canada Creek joining Wood Creek. So this is the confluence. I don't move, I just turn to the right and I look to the east and I look upstream. This is Wood Creek, and you can see it's not much of a stream. It's probably, 4, maybe 5 yards wide. If you were to walk across it, it wouldn't be up to your shins. So not much of a waterway. That was one of the problems. Then I just turned the opposite direction to the left, and now I'm looking westward. This is still Wood Creek, but it looks like it's 3 or 4 times wider than it was in the other direction. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why it looks awesome? It looks so much bigger?
Canada Creek.
Exactly, sir. Canada Creek now adds its water to Wood Creek. So now, usually there's enough water for loaded bateau to navigate Wood Creek westward to Oneida Lake. And you can see why it's called Wood Creek, because one of the problems here is that it was always full of wood. Trees, branches are constantly falling into the creek. There was a constant struggle to keep the creek cleared. So think of that little stream. But now try to imagine large armies involving thousands upon thousands of soldiers and everything they had to carry with them coming through. So not only did constant military traffic to supply and reinforce the British forts of Oswego during the French and Indian War use the landing at the confluence of Wood and Canada Creeks, but 3 large-scale offensive operations also passed through the site. So in 1758, an army of over 3,000 provincials passed through on their way to attack and destroy the French Fort Frontenac, where Kingston, Ontario is located today. Next year, 1759, a force of about 5,000 British regulars, American provincials, and allied Iroquois warriors traveled through this landing on their way to attack and capture Fort Niagara from the French. In 1760, that saw the largest British army, well, actually the largest army ever, to pass through the Oneida Carrying Place. General Sir Geoffrey Amherst led it between 10 and 12,000 men on their way to capture Montreal, the capital of New France, thus effectively ending the French and Indian War. Around 20 years later, during the Revolution, another British army came through the same area, this time traveling eastward to attack Fort Schuyler, which the Americans renamed from Fort Stanwix. This force numbered approximately 1,600 men and was a mixed column of British regulars, German Jaegers, American loyalists, and allied Native Americans. Having been repulsed at Fort Schuyler, this British force retreated through the same site. Okay, as I said, the British wanted to reestablish their position at Oswego, but first they needed to refortify the Oneida Carry. General John Stanwix is sent to the Carry with a provisional army and builds Fort Stanwix in 1758. This is the first step in fortifying a route to Oswego with 5 smaller forts between Fort Stanwix and Oswego, where they will rebuild Fort Ontario. One thing we found, we didn't use this to get the signage, but we found interesting. This is a reference from the orderly book of the 78th Regiment of Foot at Fort Stanwix in November 1758 to 59. The 78th, also known as Fraser's Highlanders, were the first troops to garrison Fort Stanwix. In garrison alongside the Highlanders was a company of Rogers Rangers under the command of Captain Henry Isaac Wendell. An entry dated January 14, 1759 reads, "Yesterday, Lieutenant Hart of Captain Wendell's Rangers returned from his scout to Canada Creek and the Green Carrying Place, one day out, discovering nothing." Discovering nothing isn't very interesting. What I found interesting is these Rangers were on the Oneida Carry. They leave Fort Stanwix, they go to Canada Creek, and they find a place called the Green Carrying Place. What in the world and where is the Green Carrying Place? I hope somebody here can tell me that later. The British fortify their waterway supply route to Oswego in 1758-59. First, they build Fort Stanwix. Next, they rebuild Fort Newport on the upper landing of Wood Creek. So here's Fort Stanwix, and there's across the Carry is Fort Newport. They're going to put forts all along the supply route to Oswego. One place is going to be Fort Rickey, the Royal Blockhouse near Sylvan Beach, Fort Brewerton on the other end of Lake Oneida, a place that will later become known as Fort Bradstreet, where Fulton, New York is today, and then finally they are going to rebuild Fort Ontario. So British plans to assault New France for the year 1759 focused on reestablishing their fortification at Oswego and the capture of the French fortress at Niagara. They learned that to succeed with this plan, they needed to strengthen their supply line to Oswego by fortifying key points along the water route between the Oneida Carry and Lake Ontario. They do this by first rebuilding Fort Newport on the upper landing of Wood Creek. Next, a small post at the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek is erected. Then they build the Royal Blockhouse at the confluence of Wood Creek and Fish Creek near the entry to Oneida Lake. On the west end of Oneida Lake, at the source of the Oneida River, they construct Fort Brewerton. On the east side of the Oswego River Rapids, they erect a post later called Fort Bradstreet to guard the portage around this obstacle. Finally, they rebuild Fort Ontario at Oswego. But that small fort at the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek will become known as Fort Rickey. And there's Fort Rickey, 1759. This is drawn by a British military engineer. It's at the landing place. You can see Wood Creek coming in from the right and Canada Creek joining from the north. There's a little island right in the middle of the confluence. It says Old Dam next to it. The old dam is called the Old Dam because it was there before the fort. Now, imagine that little stream I showed you and that little fort and thousands upon thousands of men with bateaux landing there and, loading those bateaux. Here's what it looks like on a large river. Can you imagine all that going on at that little creek side? In 1759, the British build the Royal Blockhouse where Wood Creek joins Fish Creek near Sylvan Beach on the Oneida Lake. This point guards the mouth of Wood Creek. The model of the Royal Blockhouse is the creation of historian Jack Frost. At the western end of Oneida Lake, the British built Fort Brewerton in 1759. This post guards the entry from Oneida Lake to the Oneida River. The earthy remains of this fort's ditch can be visited and observed in Brewerton, New York, along Route 11. On the left is an image from the time of Fort Brewerton. On the right is an oil painting that's on display at the Oliver Stevens Blockhouse Museum at Fort Brewerton. Here is an aerial view of Fort Brewerton. You can see the blockhouse on the right, that's the museum. But if you see that shape, that is the actual 1759 earthen remains of the fort. So it's a 8-pointed star. Also in 1759, at the rapids of the Oswego River, where Fulton, New York is today, the British built a stockaded post to guard the portage site that went around the rapids. This fort, later called Fort Bradstreet, is mentioned in the opening chapter of James Fenimore Cooper's The Pathfinder, and it was another 8-pointed star fort. The British returned to Oswego and rebuilt Fort Ontario in 1759. From there, a British army goes west to successfully besiege the French Fort Niagara. Now, here we have rebuilt Fort Ontario. Right here. And where's my volunteer? Mary. What was the shape of that fort?
This fort
No, the one I told you. A rectangle. It had 4 bastions. Is this a rectangle with 4 bastions? How many bastions do you see there? 5. And what do we call a geometric shape that has 5 sides? A pentagon. So that, if you visit Fort Ontario today, that's what you're going to see, that shape of a fort. Another thing, another piece of primary source information we used to get the signage was a diagram of Fort Stanwix. It was not the diagram of the fort itself, but what was written on it. This 1759 profile of a section of Fort Stanwix includes a description of work completed from July to December of 1759 outside Fort Stanwix. It reads, building a post at Canada Creek to contain 50 men and making a floodgate at Bull's Fort to raise the water to bring up the battery up and down. So if I blow that up, I don't know, we probably still can't read it, but it says right here, made a post at Canada Creek to contain 50 men. So that was kind of a needed piece of information that we had to get the signage. And again, here's that same military drawing. British military engineer William Ayer's plan was proudly actually drawn by Lieutenant Francis Pfister. It shows a T-shaped fort from the Hulbert series as it would have appeared in 1759, eventually named Fort Rickey. Here's my drawing. Obviously, I'm not a British military engineer. Where the Fort Rickey Discovery Zoo is today, there was a small French and Indian war fort built by the British in 1759. This post guarded a dam across Wood Creek where Canada Creek adds its waters to Wood Creek. From here to Oneida Lake, there was usually enough water, deep enough to navigate the bateau. This is from Phil Lord's Waterways West. He was an archaeologist for New York State. And he wrote, the first layer of historic sites in Wood Creek are those built during the French and Indian War, including forts and navigation sluices. Here at Canada Creek, we have both in the same place. Fort Rickey on the knoll to the south and the site of the navigation dam, which he says is a sluice, in the creek opposite. I don't think that was a sluice, that dam. I think it was just a dam. But I'm not the archaeologist, Phil Lord is. Until recently, a replica of the fort was in place on its original site as part of the Fort Rickey Game Farm establishment. The knoll on which the original fort stood is still clearly visible within the game farm property. Lee Hansen was the chief archaeologist for the National Park Service's reconstruction of Fort Stanwix. He believed that the 1759 Fort Rickey was built with horizontally placed logs. However, primary source descriptions of the 1760 fort site use the words palisades or stockades, which by definition are stakes or posts set in the ground vertically. So this is Lee Hansen's sketch. He feels that the walls were of horizontal log cribbing, as diagrammed above, probably only 2 or 3 logs high, enough cover for a man to crouch behind and fire a musket. Now, 2 or 3 logs is not very high. That's like this high, okay? Not much protection. So Dr. Gabler, who owned the site, reconstructed the fort. He made it 5 logs high. And I was in that fort. It's not there anymore, but I was in it, and it only comes up to the middle of my chest. That's probably, I think, more accurate than 2 logs high. It's enough because you're up on a hill, too, and so that's probably affording you enough protection. You can see here, Wood Creek is right in here. Canada Creek is where this dark area is here. So the fort was well situated to guard that confluence. Here's a 2015 Google Earth image of the fort site. You can see Wood Creek, Canada Creek coming in, and I don't know if you can see the outline that the owner at the time built with some bricks just to outline the fort. The wooden one is gone. If I blow it up, you can see it a little bit better. They had a building there. Right now that building has monkeys in it. The little white things you see on the north side of the building are playground equipment for the children that were visiting the zoo. Members of the Oneida Carry Research Group recently visited the actual site of Fort Rickey, which the current owners of the property have outlined with bricks. And you can see the bricks there. But notice these members of the Oneida Carry Research Group are all smiling. Anybody know why they're all smiling? It's because they're members of the Oneida Carry Research Group. Oh, really? Strategically located along that outline are these signs. They're telling you do not sit or climb on the wall, because if you do, it's going over. So in case you go there, be warned. Now, some of our other research, some of the following information on Fort Rickey is from the Annals and Recollections, Volume 2, Number 19, published by the Rome Historical Society, dated July 1988. It is authored by Dr. William M. Forbes, editor. Unfortunately, Dr. Forbes never listed his source material, so we have a double of a time trying to verify some of his information. Most of the time it's correct, but there are times when he doesn't have it correct. Hopefully, we feel that what follows is correct. He writes, Captain John Rickey of the New Jersey Blues Regiment was the first officer to use the post opposite the mouth of Canada Creek as his base of operations. He and his men worked in the bateau service from June 2nd to November 4th, 1759, for which John Bradstreet paid him 713 pounds, 7 shillings, New York currency. There seems to be some question as to whether Captain Rickey actually paid all of his men in full for their service, and that becomes an issue. So how does Fort Rickey get its name? Based on the provided research results, Fort Rickey is mentioned in the context of the French and Indian War. According to the snippets, Captain John Rickey was associated with a fortification in the region specifically. It seems certain that Captain Rickey was the first officer to use the new post opposite the mouth of Canada Creek as his base of operations, and his name became associated with the post, which was dubbed Fort Rickey. So that's how it got its name. When I talk to people about Fort Rickey, they think it's a toy made by Mattel or something, Fort Rickey. It doesn't sound like a fort name, but it was. Next in our research to use for the signage we use the journal of General Jeffrey Amherst as he's moving through the Carry on his way to attack Montreal in 1760. He writes, "I set off at daybreak, breakfasted with Lieutenant Colonel Massey," that would be at Fort Stanwix, "and rid 4 miles to Fort Bull, where there is a sluice, and a little below the fort a new sluice making. Then rid 4 miles to Canada Creek, where there is an officer's post and a stockaded post with a dam for stopping the water from Canada Creek." Something doesn't seem right there. Stop a dam for stopping the water from Canada Creek. Because if we look at the map of Fort Rickey in 1759, here's Canada Creek. Wood Creek is flowing westward. Canada Creek water doesn't take a hard left turn and go upstream against Wood Creek and then take a hard right to get behind that dam. It just doesn't work that way. So that dam is not stopping the water of Canada Creek. So something must be different. Next in our search, we found this map. It's the course of Canada Creek, taken by His Order of Excellency General Amherst by Engineer Francis Pfister around 1761. This end is the south. This is Canada Creek through here to the north. We're going to focus on the south end here. The course of Canada Creek taken by Francis Pfister. This is from the Kashner Collection of Early American Maps. And if we blow it up here, you can see the confluence of Canada Creek and Wood Creek. If I blow it up some more, you can see it's different looking than the 1759 image. No longer is that dam between the fort and that island. There's now a bridge over Canada Creek. And you can see the dotted line, that's the road going all the way from the Carry, Oneida Carry, to Oneida Lake. This says sluice in Wood Creek. It's past Canada Creek. A sluice acts like a canal lock on Wood Creek. So now water from Canada Creek is going to be stopped by this dam and sluice. So this is what General Amherst is describing. But if you look at the fort, it's not a T-shape anymore. It's a 4-pointed star. It's on the same hilltop, but it's not the same shape anymore. There is a comparison, the 1759 fort and what Engineer Pfister saw in 1761. Two different things. How can that be? The 1760 Fort Rickey could have been a stockade with vertical posts set in the ground. Why do we have two different Fort Rickeys at the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek? There was a question if Captain Rickey actually paid his bateaumen in full. These men burnt the fort to the ground in October 1759. In 1760, when General Amherst was on his way through the Mohawk Valley to attack Montreal, he ordered the fort rebuilt to support his campaign. That's why we have a second Fort Rickey with a different configuration. There is the Oneida Carry as it would look in 1760. If I blow it up, you will see to the right there is Fort Stanwix near the Mohawk. The reconstructed Fort Newport at the upper landing on Wood Creek, and the reconstructed Fort Rickey at the lower landing over on the left, the lower landing of Wood Creek. Now, this is one of my favorite images of how to operate a bateau. This is from Phil Lord's website, Waterways West. It appears he's citing Benjamin Wright in 1801. Benjamin Wright, of course, is becomes the chief engineer for construction of the Erie Canal in 1817. It appears the dams or sluices erected sometimes 35 or 40 years past, around 1758, were nothing more than common dams, built after the manner of mill dams, as to raise about 4 feet perpendicular, of which there were 2 between Rome and Canada Creek, and 1 immediately below the junction of Wood and Canada Creeks, which is the one we just talked about. And by a means of a windlass, the boats were drawn up the pitch made by raising the gate of the sluices. So here you see the bateau, how they're operated. You see it's 2 guys with poles, and they're pushing the bateau. And if you can see, maybe you can't see, but this guy here has an oar right here, this guy. You got polemen, and then you also have people pushing. Does anybody notice anything unusual about that image? Let me blow it up for you. Okay, Abigail, off you go. Heave ho. Just when did chivalry die? I mean, really. Following its victory over France in the French Indian War, Britain declared the Proclamation Line of 1763. It reserved land west of the line for Indian nations and forbade colonial settlement in that area. That did not make the colonists very happy. 5 years later, the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek served as the northern point of the Fort Stanwix Treaty Line of 1768. So again, that confluence site is of import. The northern point of the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix was the confluence of Canada Creek and Wood Creek. This alteration of the 1763 Proclamation Line was negotiated by Sir William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs. It put the Oneida Carry firmly within British colonial territory, but also placed the Oneida village of Oriska there as well. This led to some Oneida anger, and was one of the reasons for their support of the Patriot cause in 1777 during the Revolution. Next journal we found was Ebenezer Elmer. He was an American soldier during the Revolution. He's traveling through the Carry. This is about 11 months before the siege of Fort Stanwix. And he wrote, 4 miles farther down is a creek putting up to the north, therefore called Canada Creek, at the mouth of which was a small fort now totally destroyed. So by the Revolution, there was no Fort Rickey. It was either just fell into ruins or by agreement with the Oneidas, dismantled, because the Oneidas only allowed them to build these forts on the condition that they not remain after the French and Indian War. Then probably the best book I've written, I didn't write it, I read it. It was Gavin Watt's book, Rebellion in the Mohawk Valley. He's describing an incident at the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek. At the siege of Fort Stanwix, the British and the Indians hear that there's a huge American army being led by Benedict Arnold is on their way to relieve the siege. The Indians start to take off. They're disgruntled. They start threatening and robbing the British soldiers or allies. And the British have no choice but to also retreat. And they're afraid of this Benedict Arnold army. It's been described as so large that there are as many soldiers as there are leaves on the trees. So they're trying to get out of Dodge as fast as they can. One of the bateaux gets to the confluence of Canada Creek and Wood Creek. They're kind of in a big hurry because they don't want General Arnold. They think he's right on their heels. They want to lighten their load so they can move faster. So at the confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek somewhere, they jettisoned a 3-pounder tube. That's a cannon tube. They got rid of it near the junction of Canada Creek. Is it still there? I don't know. Following American victory in the War of Independence, the West was open for settlement. The Wood Creek Waterway West continued to be utilized by Americans heading for new settlements. Improvements of the Wood Creek by the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company in the late 1790s and early 1800s made travel along Wood Creek shorter, easier, faster, and cheaper. The confluence of Wood Creek and Canada Creek became a busy landing place frequented by these new migrants. And again, from Waterways West, Phil Lord, during the 1790s, early 1800s, taverns were located at the junction. Armstrong's to the west was initially a farmhouse which entertained travelers, while Rainey's to the east was apparently a public house from the start. Later, a man named Gilbert took over the Rainey's Tavern and developed the area with a sawmill and a storehouse. Once the Erie Canal was completed, however, miles to the south, traffic through Canada Creek complex decreased sharply. And this is from the Journal of James Cockburn in 1792. At the junction of Canada Creek and Wood Creek is a good farm possessed by the widow Armstrong. She has about 20 acres cleared, and it is a good situation for business, it being always a halting place for bateau. So it was busy then before the Erie Canal. If I blow it up, you can see here is Canada Creek, Wood Creek. This is the Oswego Road today. Route 46 or 49 Rome New London Road would end up going this way. There's Rainey's Tavern and Armstrong's Tavern. On September 5th, 2025, the Oneida County History Center and the Oneida Carry Research Group dedicated this William G. Pomeroy Foundation historical marker at the Fort Rickey Discovery Zoo. And here we see, yours truly, here's Rebecca McLean. She's the director here. These two are the owners of the Fort Rickey property, Chris and Rebecca Stedman. This young lady is Jody Oakes. She is representing here the William G. Pomeroy Foundation that got the grant for the sign. There is Joseph Pierce. He did the majority of the research and able to get this sign. And we have a couple of reenactors. The honor of unveiling the William G. Pomeroy Foundation historical marker for Fort Rickey was given to Oneida Carry Research Group member Sarah Kinnison, who began this project several years ago. She is being assisted by fellow Oneida Carry Research Group member Joseph Pierce, who performed much of the research needed to secure this marker. The Oneida Carry Research Group wishes to express its appreciation to the Oneida County History Center for its cooperation and assistance in securing a Pomeroy Grant historical marker for the Fort Rickey site and for hosting this presentation. We also want to thank you for attending. And now a word from our sponsor. Interested in the Oneida Carry Research Group? If so, our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, November 4th at 5 o'clock in the Jervis Library Auditorium, that's in Rome. See me immediately following this presentation to learn more. Any questions? Joseph.
I accidentally have a few answers for you.
You do? Well, thank God.
And I have the electronics to give you that'll have it. We took the USPS LiDAR of the area. And you can see across the creek, there's a set of pickets that were built.
Is that it? Yeah?
Picket posts. That's the 1760s pickets that they're talking about. So it's like that was like the captain's post, and what they did is they built pickets there, which matches basically. But we actually have the 1759, 1758, and 1760 letters from Thomas Gage, which I transcribed, which fill in a lot of the blanks you have.
Oh, good.
And it's absolutely terrific stuff. It talks about the entire, how the system worked. So it's one of these things that I want to make sure you guys have that.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
And I actually have in my pocket a flash drive for you.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Joe Robitasio there is a prominent historian from Utica, right, Joe? Yes.
Yeah, and it really is a fascinating, you've actually done a terrific job on this.
Oh, thank you very much. Any other questions?
You did an excellent talk.
Thank you. That's not a question, that's a statement. Thank you very much anyways. Okay.
Explained it very well.
Thank you.
Somebody who's not from here.
Any other questions? Yes.
Where does Fort Bull, as far as time goes?
Ah.
At the same time as Fort Rickey, or before or after?
It's before Fort Rickey. Fort Rickey was, the first Fort Rickey was in 1759. The second one is 1760. Fort Bull was built late fall 1755. On March 27th, 1756, it was attacked and just blown up by the French and Indians. Then it was replaced by a fort called Fort Wood Creek. The remains of Fort Wood Creek you can still see. It's located behind the Erie Canal Village in Rome. But those are the actual 1756 remains of a French and Indian War fort. Those remains were nominated successfully by the Oneida Carry Research Group to be placed on the National Registry of Historic Places. And we're thinking along those same lines for the confluence of Wood Creek, the lower landing of Wood Creek complex for the National Registry. That's going to be a lot more research than what we did for the signage. Okay. Yes.
I have a lot to give you on that. I've been working on that.
Bless you, Joe.
What we found is the real story of Fort Bull is much more horrific than we thought.
Yeah. It was pretty horrific when we did think about it, yeah.
It hadn't been translated properly, and with the proper translation, it's like a lot of the guys were alive fighting for their lives inside the fort and the barracks.
Oh, yeah.
One of the magazine blew, and we actually were able to trace what happens with great precision.
That's fascinating. It really is.
John, how the system of forts work, you have Fort Stanwix away from the carrying place, but it's the largest fort there. So was there the main detachment that were assigned forces housed at Fort Stanwix, and then there were smaller detachments that were down at the individual? And was the main body called out to the smaller ones whenever they were under attack to reinforce them?
Okay. In 1756, there were, let me go back to the map here. I think there. Oh, there it is. Okay. 1756, there's no Fort Stanwix. There's Fort Craven, never quite finished. Fort Williams was the first fort built on the Carry. Fort Newport at the upper landing of Wood Creek, this is Wood Creek. They built a dam across Wood Creek, created this reservoir. That reservoir was there for many, many, many years. Then further downstream, that's why they put Fort Wood Creek, which I talked about in this inset here. That's the fort that replaced Fort Bull, but there's no Fort Stanwix. What you see in the middle here is an encampment of General Webb. General Webb arrived on the Oneida Carry sometime in August of 1756. He's on his way to Oswego. However, at the same time, Oswego falls to the French and is destroyed. He makes a decision. Well, these forts only exist here to support Oswego. I can't stop them if they come up to the Mohawk Valley, so I have to burn all these forts we just built. And he does. So he burns his own forts. He hightails it out to German Flats and eventually Fort Edward, leaving the Mohawk Valley open for raids. But where his encampment was is where Fort Stanwix is going to be built 2 years later. So these forts aren't around when Fort Stanwix is built. Fort Stanwix will be built here. It's not that far from the Mohawk River, but it's on higher ground. That was one good thing about it. And it was large enough, and it could support a large enough garrison to, I think, answer your question, Dick, about sending troops out to patrol the landing places. Like that journal, or that orderly book I read about the Wendell's Rangers. They went out to the lower landing as on a patrol and said they found nothing. So they're doing that. They're patrolling. They're watching. Okay. They do rebuild Fort Newport. So Fort Newport will be there at the same time as Fort Stanwix. But that's the only other fort there. Then 1759 and 1760, you had the two Fort Rickeys. So these other forts, Craven, Williams, Wood Creek, Bull, they're not around during the Fort Stanwix time. I don't know if that answers your question. Yep.
Do the smaller forts have cannons and bigger armaments?
Fort Rickey probably had no cannons. Maybe it had a swivel gun. I don't know. Maybe Joe may know more about that than I do. Fort Craven had cannons. Fort Williams had 4 cannons mounted. We think those were swivel guns. As far as we know, well, Fort Bull didn't have any cannons. It didn't even have any loopholes in the walls. Fort Wood Creek did not have any cannons that we know of. Neither did Fort Newport that we know of. So Fort Stanwix, yes. Fort Craven had small ones. Fort Craven had them, and Fort Williams had small ones. They're probably the only ones that had cannons.
Were all of these forts attacked and re-attacked?
The only one that was attacked during the French and Indian War was Fort Bull. It was totally destroyed. It had to be rebuilt with Fort Wood Creek. Fort Stanwix was not attacked during the French and Indian War. There were raiding parties. They would capture and murder some Highlanders and other garrison around, but not any major attack. Not until the Revolutionary War in August of 1777 did Fort Stanwix come under siege from the British, and that didn't work out so well for them. But that's the only, of course, that's associated with the Battle of Battle of Oriskany too.
Most of those forts saw no action then.
What's that?
Most of the little forts didn't seem.
You're right. Other than ducking raiding parties, no major attacks other than the French in 1756 and the British in 1777. Yes?
What exactly was Fort Newport? I can kind of.
Okay, Fort Newport. That's right here. It's do you know Rome at all? Okay, do you know where Arsenal Street is and Calvert Street? There you go. Right about there, yes. Yep. Right along the side. It was along the side of Wood Creek. From what I understand, Wood Creek is not exactly in the same course it was back in 1756 when that fort was built. I think it was a little more to the east.
We actually have now a good engineers camp for 1762 of that fort.
Oh, okay, yes. That's the rebuilt fort, yes. Yeah, I've got that. That's great. That's how I figured out it was rebuilt. Yeah. Yes?
The dam just east or west of Fort Rickey, on the combined water of Canada and Wood Creek.
Are you talking about this picture? Or the rebuilt one?
Yeah, there was a dam.
Let's see. Oh, there's two of them.
Now the dam, it allows Canada Creek to go off on some other route.
Here's Canada Creek. It's got to go this way. It doesn't have a choice.
I wondered if that dam would control the flow of water west on
Wood Creek. That's exactly what I think. I think they just plugged this up to force the current north here. The landing is actually up here. The fort guards the landing, but the landing is up here because the road was up here.
Well, I was wondering if they were using that to control the flow of water west on Wood Creek to assist, say, if you open the dam and you had boat in there, it would tend to carry that boat for maybe a couple of miles.
I think you're exactly right. And that's why they took it out here and they replaced it with a sluice. Notice this one doesn't say sluice, it's just a dam. You're right, this becomes, they would close this up, it would form a reservoir of higher water here. When the bateaux are loaded and ready to go, they would open it up and away they went. They did the same thing at Fort Wood Creek with a sluice gate there. They did the same thing just above Fort Newport on Wood Creek. So they had a whole system of these sluices. And they built other sluices along Wood Creek, not even near the landing sites. Yep. Welcome. Any other questions?
John, thank you very much from all of us.
Well, thank you all for being here. I enjoyed it.